He saved my daughter, but when I saw his face, I couldn't breathe. The girl in the rain. The town of Millersfield had always been quiet in the way small towns are rhythmic, familiar, tucked away from the chaos of big cities. But on that Thursday afternoon, just as the summer sun began to disappear behind a fast-rolling wave of grey clouds, something was shifting. The streets, usually lined with laughing children and open windows, were starting to clear as thunder rumbled low in the distance. Julia Blake stood in the kitchen of her modest two-story home, her hands still damp from washing dishes, staring out the window at the backyard. Her daughter Ava was still outside, playing near the swing set. "Ava," she called out, her voice sharp over the sound of wind. "Come inside, sweetie, it's going to storm," but the 7-year-old didn't respond. Instead, Ava kept running in circles, barefoot, her long brown hair flying behind her like a ribbon. She had always been a little wild, curious, full of energy, and far too fearless for Julia's liking. With a deep sigh, Julia wiped her hands on a towel, grabbed a sweater, and stepped out onto the porch. The air was electric. There was a scent of ozone, fresh but heavy. That quiet before the sky breaks open. "Ava, come here," Julia tried again. This time Ava turned, smiling, but didn't run toward her mother. Instead, her eyes widened slightly as she looked toward the front gate. And then she screamed. Not a playful scream, but the kind that freezes a parent's blood. Julia's legs moved before her brain did. She sprinted through the yard, her shoes slapping against the wet grass. As she rounded the side of the house toward the gate, her heart dropped. Ava was no longer in sight. Ava didn't know why she ran. She didn't even know what she had seen. Just a flicker of movement beyond the fence, and then something in her gut had twisted. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was instinct. She ducked through the gate and out into the narrow street beyond their neighborhood. The clouds above had darkened so much the streetlights had turned on early, flickering orange against the wet pavement. As the rain began to fall, first a drizzle, then a sudden steady pour, Ava turned into the path that led to the creek near the woods. Her bare feet splashed through puddles. She was fast but not careful. A root caught her foot and she tumbled forward, hitting the muddy ground hard. When she looked up, there was a car, silver sleek, unfamiliar, coming fast around the bend. She couldn't move in time. The screech of tires split the air. The car came to a hard stop just inches away from her. The door flew open and a man jumped out, his expression unreadable. Under the shadow of the storm, he knelt beside her quickly, his hands hovering over her arms without touching. "Are you hurt? Can you move?" he asked, voice firm but calm. Ava stared up at him, her mouth trembling. My mom. She's back there." The man looked around, saw no one, then scooped her up gently. "We'll find her. But first, let's get you out of this rain." Julia had never run so fast in her life. Her hair was soaked, her hands shook. She screamed Ava's name into the streets, into the trees, into the rain. A neighbor came out with an umbrella, but she waved him off. Her daughter was gone. The panic choked her chest. Then through the curtain of falling rain, she saw a figure approaching, a man, carrying a child, her child. "Ava," she cried, sprinting forward. The man slowed, his arms protectively cradling the little girl. Ava looked up from his chest and reached toward her mother. "She's okay," the man said as Julia reached them, dropping to her knees. "Oh my God, thank you," Julia sobbed, grabbing her daughter and pulling her close. She touched her face, her eyes checked for injuries, then kissed her forehead over and over. She ran into the road. The man explained quietly. "I almost hit her." Julia looked up to thank him, and then she froze. Her mouth parted, but no sound came out. The man's face. That jawline, those eyes, that small scar above his left eyebrow. It couldn't be. Jack, she whispered. The man blinked, startled. He looked at her again, closer this time, then stepped back, nearly dropping his umbrella. Julia, the storm, the town, the rain, all of it disappeared for a moment. There was only the past hurtling back with full force. They hadn't seen each other in 13 years. Jack Cole had left Millersfield after high school and hadn't looked back. He had been the town's golden boy, athletic, smart, charming. Everyone thought he'd marry Julia Blake and they'd live the perfect small-town love story. But everything had changed after the fire. After the night Julia's older brother died in the cabin up by the ridge, a fire that Jack had always been blamed for. Though he was never formally charged, Julia's family had cut all ties. Jack had left town under a cloud of suspicion and whispered accusations. But now here he was, saving Julia's daughter. "Of all people, I didn't know you were back," she said slowly, her voice trembling. "I'm not," he said, his voice thick. "Just passing through, visiting a client. I saw her in the road. God, I thought I hit her." Julia stood there in stunned silence, holding Ava tight, and then almost instinctively she stepped forward and hugged him. He didn't move at first. Then he let his arms wrap around her lightly, unsure, as if waiting for her to pull away. "I thought I'd never see you again," she whispered. Jack didn't answer. He just closed his eyes and held on. That night, after Ava was safely tucked into bed and the rain had slowed to a whisper against the windows, Julia sat on the couch staring into a mug of untouched tea. Her mind reeled Jack Cole, the name she hadn't dared speak in over a decade, the name her parents had forbidden in their house. The boy who had once held her hand and promised her forever and then vanished in the wake of tragedy. He had saved her daughter. She didn't believe in fate, she never had. But tonight, she wasn't so sure. The fire that never died. The next morning in Millersfield dawned clear, as if the storm had washed everything clean, but inside Julia's chest, the clouds still lingered. She stared out the kitchen window as she stirred her coffee, the spoon clinking against the ceramic with an uneven rhythm. Ava was sitting at the kitchen table eating cereal and humming softly, as if nothing extraordinary had happened the day before, as if her mother hadn't come face to face with the ghost of her past. Jack Cole. Even just thinking his name sent a strange rush of emotions through Julia: grief, confusion, guilt, and something else. Something she didn't dare name yet. She hadn't told Ava anything. Not about who Jack was, not about the fire, not about what had happened 13 years ago when her whole world fell apart. How could she not, when she hadn't even come to terms with it herself? 13 years earlier, it had been one of those restless July nights, the kind where the air sticks to your skin and everything feels more alive than it should. Julia was 17, Jack had just turned 18, and her brother Marcus was back in town for the summer after his first year of college. That night, a group of teens, including Jack, Marcus, and a few others, had gone up to the old cabin on the ridge. It was tradition, a bonfire, beers, music. The kind of summer memory you only realize is dangerous in hindsight. Julia was supposed to go, but she had a cold, and her father had put his foot down. So she stayed home watching old movies on VHS, drifting in and out of sleep. Then the phone rang. There had been a fire. The cabin was gone and Marcus was dead. According to the reports, Jack was the last person to see him alive. The official cause, unattended fire pit. Alcohol, maybe someone knocked over a lantern. But the rumors spread faster than the flames ever had, and they all pointed in one direction. Jack Cole. He left town before the funeral. No goodbye. No explanation. Just gone. Back in the present, Julia was still standing at the sink when her phone buzzed on the counter. She picked it up, expecting a text from a friend or maybe Ava's school. But it was a name she hadn't seen in years. Call from Claire McNeil. Claire had been her best friend in high school, and Jack's too once. They hadn't spoken much after the fire. Not because of a fight, but because everything had fractured. Julia hesitated, then answered. "Hey," she said cautiously. "Jules." Claire's voice was warm but laced with tension. "You okay?" Julia blinked. "Why wouldn't I be? I heard Jack was back." "Of course, in a town like Millersfield, nothing stayed secret for long. He's not back," Julia said quietly. "He was just passing through. Are you sure that's all it is?" Julia didn't answer. Claire hesitated, then said, "He came into the library yesterday, asked about old town records, blueprints, fire reports." Julia's stomach twisted. "Jules, I think he's trying to prove something. Something about that night." That afternoon, while Ava was at school, Julia found herself driving the old country road that led to the ridge. She hadn't been up there in over a decade. The path was more overgrown, now the once worn trail nearly swallowed by weeds and wildflowers, but she found it the clearing where the cabin used to stand. There was nothing left now, just scorched earth long since reclaimed by nature, a few bricks, a rusted bottle cap, and the heavy silence of a memory that refused to fade. She sat on a fallen log, the wind rustling through the trees, and closed her eyes. Marcus had been more than a brother. He was her hero, her protector. And that summer, just before everything fell apart, he had been distant, worried. Julia had thought it was college stress or something he didn't want to burden her with, and now she wasn't so sure. What if there had been something more? What if Jack hadn't been guilty? What if all these years she'd been angry at the wrong person? The thought made her chest ache. Back in town, Jack stood outside the county records office, a manila folder in one hand, coffee in the other. He had come back to Millersfield not for closure but for truth. For 13 years, he had carried the weight of a fire he didn't start. He remembered that night too vividly. Marcus had pulled him aside, away from the others. He'd seemed tense, distracted. Jack had assumed it was just the beer, or maybe an argument with their dad. Marcus always had a rough time with his old man, but there was something else in his eyes. Before Jack could ask, someone shouted, "Smoke." Flames. It all happened too fast. Jack had dragged 2 kids out himself, but when he ran back for Marcus, the flames were too high. He had to be pulled away, and then came the blame. He never fought it. Maybe part of him felt like he deserved it for surviving, but recently an anonymous email had arrived in his inbox, a scanned page from an insurance claim dated 2 weeks before the fire. Filed by Marcus, the cabin had been insured for nearly double its value. Jack had spent the last 3 months trying to find answers, and now face to face with Julia again. He wasn't sure what he feared more, clearing his name or reopening her wounds. That evening, Julia sat at her desk long after Ava had gone to bed, staring at a photo of Marcus. In it, he was holding a young Julia on his shoulders, both of them laughing, sun in their hair. She traced the edge of the frame with her finger, then on impulse, she pulled out the old tin box from her closet. Inside were letters, birthday cards, a few receipts, and one torn page from Marcus's notebook, folded and yellowed. She unfolded it slowly. It read, "If something happens to me, it won't be an accident. I know too much." Her blood ran cold. She had never really understood that line. She'd chalked it up to teenage melodrama, or maybe one of Marcus's half-written poems, but now, she wasn't sure. The next day, Jack knocked on Julia's door. This time, she opened it without hesitation. They stood in the hallway, the weight of the years thick between them. "I need to talk to you," he said simply. "About the fire?" she asked. He nodded. She stepped aside. "Then let's talk." Secrets in the ashes. The living room was quiet except for the hum of the ceiling fan and the occasional sound of Ava playing in the backyard. Julia and Jack sat on opposite ends of the couch, a chasm of silence between them despite their physical closeness. On the coffee table between them lay a copy of the fire department's original report and the folded, yellowed page from Marcus's notebook. Jack had read the note twice already. Each time he leaned back with a deeper frown. "If something happens to me, it won't be an accident. I know too much." Jack tapped the edge of the paper thoughtfully. He knew something. But what? What could Marcus have been caught up in that would make him think someone wanted him dead? Julia stared out the window, her voice low. Marcus was always aware of people, of secrets, but he never said anything. He was protective. Sometimes too protective. Especially with me, I thought it was just a big brother thing. Jack looked over at her. "Do you remember if he had issues with anyone, like anyone dangerous?" Julia hesitated. "There was one guy from his summer job. He worked construction for a local developer, said the guy was shady, cutting corners, falsifying permits, but that never seemed serious enough for this." "Do you remember the name?" Jack asked quickly. She nodded slowly. "Colt Mason. He was in his 30s then, owned some kind of contracting business." Jack's brow furrowed. "Mason. I've seen that name. He owns a chain of hardware stores now. One of them helped rebuild after the fire." "That's a strange coincidence." Julia sat back, crossing her arms. "You think this guy had something to do with the fire?" "I don't know yet," Jack replied. "But I do know. Marcus filed an insurance policy on the cabin right before it burned, and Colt Mason was the one who inspected the cabin for code violations that summer." Julia blinked. "So you're saying Marcus might have been onto something, like a scam?" Jack shrugged. "Or he was being silenced before he could say anything." "I don't want to believe it, Jules. But that night, it didn't feel like an accident." For the first time in years, Julia heard something she hadn't allowed herself to consider, that Marcus's death might not have been just bad luck or youthful recklessness, that maybe, just maybe, they'd all believed the wrong version of the story for far too long. That weekend, while Ava stayed over with a friend, Julia and Jack drove out to the county archives. It was a dusty building tucked behind the courthouse filled with aging boxes. The scent of mildew and old paper hanging in the air. They requested files related to the fire, insurance claims, incident reports, and anything that mentioned Colt Mason or the cabin property. It took hours of sifting through faded documents and yellowing manila folders, but then Julia found something that made her go still. "Jack, look at this." It was a building permit signed 2 weeks before the fire. The property owner was listed as Marcus Blake and Jack Cole jointly. The ink was clear. The names were typed and Jack's face paled. "I never signed this. Did Marcus ever mention putting your name on anything?" "Never. We weren't business partners. We were just friends." "Why would he do that?" Julia flipped to the back of the document. "Here." She pointed to a signature. Jack leaned closer. "That's not my handwriting." Julia looked up at him, eyes wide. "Then someone forged your name, and that means that someone wanted you to look involved," she finished. The air felt heavier. Suddenly Jack stood pacing. "So either Marcus was part of this and set me up, which I don't believe, or someone used his name and mine to file fraudulent documents, and then burned it down to cover the trail." Jack looked at her, eyes sharp, "or to eliminate the risk of exposure." There was a long pause, then Julia said, "We need to find Colt Mason." Finding Colt Mason wasn't difficult. He was something of a local success story, construction mogul turned entrepreneur. His face occasionally featured in the regional business journal. He owned 3 home improvement stores in neighboring counties and sat on the town's redevelopment board. Jack made a few calls, claimed he was looking to renovate a property on the edge of town and wanted to hire Mason's firm. They scheduled a meeting for Monday afternoon. Julia insisted on going with him. "I'm not letting you walk into that alone," she said. "You already took the fall once." On the day of the meeting, Jack and Julia arrived at the office, a sleek glass and metal structure just off the highway. It looked too polished for Millersfield, a sign of someone who had made a lot of money fast. Colt Mason was waiting in the conference room, dressed in a crisp navy suit, silver hair slicked back, a Rolex glinting on his wrist. He stood when they entered, his smile a little too practiced. "Jack Cole, I'll be damned. You were the football star, weren't you?" Jack forced a smile. "That's me. And this must be Julia Blake," she said, her voice steady. Mason hesitated for just a second, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. The conversation that followed was polite surface-level discussion about property lines, zoning laws, permit applications, but Julia watched Mason carefully. When Jack casually mentioned the old cabin on the ridge, Mason's posture changed ever so slightly. "You remember that fire?" Jack asked, tilting his head. Mason chuckled a little too quickly. "Sure. Terrible thing. Kids messing with open flames. Sad what happened to that Blake boy. You inspected that cabin that summer, didn't you?" Julia asked. Mason's eyes narrowed. "If I did, it was routine. That was years ago, and did you know, Marcus Blake filed an insurance claim, listed both his and Jack's names." Mason leaned back. "Can't say I recall." "Why all the interest?" Jack met his gaze evenly. "Just trying to understand what happened, since you know I was blamed for it." There was a beat of silence. Mason smiled thinly. "Sometimes people want to rewrite history, Mr. Cole, but the past is the past." Jack didn't smile. "Not if someone died because of it." As they left the office, Julia whispered, "He knows something." "Yeah," Jack said. "And he didn't like seeing us walk through that door." That night back at Julia's house, they sat in the backyard watching the stars come out. Ava was asleep inside, a nightlight glowing soft in her room. Julia turned to Jack. "Do you ever wish you hadn't come back?" Jack thought for a moment, then said, "No, because I saved your daughter and because I still love you, Jules." She looked down, tears threatening to spill. "You were always the boy I couldn't stop loving, even when I tried." Jack reached over and took her hand. It fit the same way it always had, perfectly. But neither of them knew that inside a dark car parked across the street, someone was watching. Someone who had been watching since the moment Jack returned to Millersfield. And they were not happy. The man in the shadows. There was something about silence at 3 a.m. that felt unnatural. The world wasn't just asleep, it was holding its breath. That's what Julia thought as she sat up in bed, heart pounding, unsure of what had woken her. Then she heard it, a creak, the sound of floorboards shifting near the back porch. She reached instinctively for her phone. No missed calls, no alerts. Just the time, 3:14 a.m. glowing back at her like a quiet warning. She tiptoed down the stairs, careful not to wake Ava. The house was still. The back porch light flicked on automatically as she moved past the kitchen window. Nothing but. Then she saw it, the faint impression of footprints in the dew-covered grass heading toward the trees. Her pulse quickened. She locked the door, pulled the curtains, and backed away, every shadow suddenly too thick, every sound too loud. Across town, Jack couldn't sleep either. He sat in his rented room above the small auto shop on Main Street, going through the documents again, fire reports, permit forms, copies of the insurance file Marcus had submitted before the fire. He had highlighted every name, every date, every discrepancy. His eyes kept drifting back to the forged signature. His name on a legal document without his consent. He rubbed his temples, then checked his phone. No new messages from Julia, but something else caught his eye. A text from a blocked number. "Stop digging or you'll get burned twice." He stared at the screen, rereading the message. His jaw tightened. Someone was watching. Someone knew what he and Julia had uncovered. He hit call, but the number was already deactivated. He immediately dialed Julia. When her phone buzzed, Julia answered on the first ring. "Jack, are you okay?" he asked. There was a pause. "I think someone was outside my house." Silence. "I got a text," Jack said quietly. "A threat. Someone's watching." Julia's voice was tight. "I saw footprints, heading toward the woods. Lock everything. I'll be there in 10. By the time Jack arrived, the night had thickened into that early morning haze where light hasn't returned, but darkness has already started to fade. Julia was waiting on the porch in a hoodie, arms wrapped around herself. Her face looked pale in the porch light. He rushed up the steps. "I'm fine." she said before he could ask again. But Ava's scared. She had a nightmare. I didn't tell her what I saw, just that I thought it was a raccoon. Jack nodded grimly. I don't think raccoons send text messages. They stood in silence, listening to the wind rustling through the trees. We're getting too close, Jack murmured. Then we keep going, Julia said, her voice low but steady. Whatever this is, it's not over. That morning, Julia went to see Claire at the library. If anyone knew how to dig through records, it was Claire. I need your help, Julia said, laying down the documents Jack had gathered. I need to find out everything about Colt, Mason real estate, past business partners, lawsuits, anything. Claire glanced over the papers. You think he's behind the fire? I think he's behind more than that. Claire's expression darkened. I'll see what I can find. Meanwhile, Jack paid a visit to someone he hadn't seen in years. Sheriff Seymour Tom Brewster, retired now, but still sharp, still respected. Tom had been the one to respond to the fire that night, and while he had always treated Jack fairly, his hands had been tied by public pressure and a lack of hard evidence. They sat on the old sheriff's porch sipping bitter coffee, the morning sun filtering through the trees. I never believed you did it, Tom said quietly, but Marcus was the golden boy. Town needed someone to blame, and you had that rebel streak. Jack nodded. I understand, but I need your help now. Tom listened as Jack outlined the insurance papers, the forged signature, and their shady connection to Colt Mason. When Jack finished, the old sheriff leaned back. You know Mason married the mayor's sister, right? Jack blinked. No, got himself connected real fast, and quieted a lot of voices along the way, including mine. You think he's capable of killing Marcus? I think he's capable of a lot worse. Jack stood. I'm going to prove it. Tom grunted. Be careful, son, that fire's been out a long time, but the people who lit it, they've been keeping warm off its ashes ever since. That night, Claire called Julia in a rush. I found something, she said, breathless. It's not just Mason. What do you mean? There was a shell company, filed the cabin's insurance, not Marcus directly, and guess whose name is on the incorporation forms? Julia's breath caught. Who? Gerald Prescott. Julia went cold. My dad. Claire's voice was quiet. It's in black and white, Jules. Your father's name is all over it, and he helped insure the cabin through a dummy company, and the beneficiary wasn't Marcus, it was Mason's firm, and the co-signer. Don't say it, Julia whispered. Marcus. The world spun. Julia dropped the phone, her ears ringing. Her father, her brother, caught up in something dark, something hidden. She remembered the night of the fire, how her father had refused to talk about it. How he'd thrown away every photo of the cabin, demanded they pretend it never existed. He hadn't been grieving. He had been covering something up. Jack found Julia standing on the edge of her backyard, eyes fixed on the tree line. I know who killed Marcus, she said, voice hollow. I just don't know if it was Mason or my father. Jack didn't speak. He just stood beside her. The shadows beneath the trees seemed to thicken, and deep within them something or someone was watching. Buried in the roots. When Julia was a child, she believed her father could fix anything. He built their back porch with his bare hands, rewired the kitchen lights when the electrician failed to show. He could calm her tears with a gentle hand on her shoulder and a don't worry, sweetheart that always made the world seem safer. Now as she stood outside the boarded-up remains of her childhood home, the place her father had once ruled with quiet authority, Julia saw everything differently. This house didn't feel safe anymore. It felt like a lie built on top of a buried truth. Jack had driven them out early that morning. The house had been sitting empty for nearly a year since Julia's parents moved into assisted living. It had once been grand white shutters, stone chimney, a swing on the front porch. Now the paint was peeling. The yard had gone wild. Ivy climbed like fingers toward the attic windows. Inside it still smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper. The walls were lined with faded photos. Julia's childhood smile, her parents' anniversary dance, Marcus in his football jersey. A family frozen in time. She moved through the house in silence, Jack following her like a shadow. They stopped in front of her father's office. Do you have a key? Jack asked. Julia shook her head. He always locked it, even when we were kids. She jiggled the handle, still locked. Jack stepped forward and pulled a small tool from his pocket. Don't ask how I know how to do this. In under 30 seconds, the door clicked open. Inside was a time capsule, dust on the windowsill, papers stacked in neat columns, and in a file cabinet with a rusted lock. Julia walked to the desk, opened drawers, sifted through pens, old receipts, letters, and then she found it. A black leather-bound journal. She opened it and felt her stomach twist. It wasn't her father's handwriting. It was Marcus's. Jack and Julia sat on the office floor, reading in silence. July 3rd, Dad doesn't want me asking questions, but I saw the check. It was from Mason's company for consulting, 10 grand. That's not nothing. July 8th. I told Jack I wanted to file the permit under both our names, thought it'd protect me in case something went wrong. I didn't tell him why. I just needed a witness. July 14th, found the insurance policy. The company name is fake. Address is a P.O. box in Richmond. Dad signed off on it. I think he knows what Mason's planning. But he won't say. July 16th, the fire is supposed to happen soon. Mason's guys are talking like it's already a done deal. I need to stop this. If something happens to me, it won't be an accident. I know too much. Julia closed the journal slowly, tears filling her eyes. He tried to stop it, she whispered. He knew. He tried to warn someone and no one listened, Jack said, his voice low with grief. They sat in silence, the weight of Marcus's words pressing down like a storm cloud. Then Jack's phone rang. It was Claire. I found something, she said. Breathless, you're not going to believe this. Claire met them at the county records office, a stack of papers in her arms. Remember that shell company she began, the one your dad helped register? Julia nodded. Well, it was dissolved a month after the fire, but before that, it purchased 4 properties in town. Guess who the buyer was listed as? She flipped the page. Evelyn Mason Colt's wife, Jack said. Claire nodded. It gets better. One of those properties is now the Mason hardware store. Julia stared at the page. So, they profited off the fire. Off the town's need to rebuild. And with your father's help, Claire added gently. The room was silent. Jack stepped back. We need to talk to him. Your father? Julia hesitated. He has dementia. Some days he barely knows who I am. Jack softened, but some memories stick even with dementia, especially the ones tied to guilt. They visited Gerald Prescott the next morning. The assisted living facility was clean, bright, with soft music playing in the background, and the faint scent of lavender in the halls. Julia hadn't been there in weeks. Guilt churned in her stomach. Her father was in the garden, seated in a wheelchair beneath the gazebo, staring at the horizon like he was waiting for someone. Hi, Dad, Julia said softly, kneeling beside him. He turned slowly. His face was thinner now, his skin fragile, but his eyes, they still held something sharp beneath the cloudiness. Jules, he said, smiling faintly, you came back. She swallowed. I wanted to ask you something about Marcus. His smile faded. Marcus, brave boy, he whispered. Dad, did you help Colt Mason with the insurance scam? Did you know what he was planning? His eyes narrowed. For a moment he looked lucid. Too loose. I tried to stop it, he muttered. Told him no. Told Marcus too. But it was too late. Stop what? Gerald looked up at Jack and something flickered in his eyes. They were going to torch it. Mason didn't care if anyone was inside. Said it would burn clean. Marcus said he'd tell the sheriff. That's when it all went wrong. Julia's voice shook. Did Mason kill him? Gerald looked down. Not with his hands, but he lit the match. Jack stepped forward. Do you remember who was there that night, who helped? Gerald's hands began to tremble. He looked around wildly. They're still watching, he whispered. Always watching. I can't. A nurse appeared, gently guiding him away. His moment of clarity had passed, but they had heard enough. Marcus had been murdered and the man responsible still walked free. That evening, Julia couldn't stop shaking. She stood in the shower long after the water had turned cold, as if trying to wash off the truth. Jack was waiting downstairs, flipping through the journal again. When she emerged, wrapped in a blanket, he met her eyes. We go to the police, she said. Jack shook his head. Not yet. We need more. Mason's powerful. He'll crush this if it's just hearsay in a journal. Then what? Jack looked at her, a plan forming in his mind. We set a trap. A fire reignited. The plan was simple in theory. Expose Colt Mason, use his arrogance against him, get him to admit on record that he orchestrated the fire, profited from the aftermath, and indirectly caused Marcus's death. The execution, that was another story. Jack stood outside the town's redevelopment council building, watching the late summer sun glint off its freshly installed windows, ironically paid for by Mason's foundation after last winter's storm damage. He checked his watch. 4:27 p.m. Julia was already inside, posing as a community advocate interested in applying for one of the Mason Revitalization Grants, a program Colt used to launder both money and influence. The idea was to get close, be polite, be curious, and let Colt do what he always did when praised talked too much. But what Colt didn't know, Julia was wearing a wire. The day before, they had driven to a neighboring town and met with Sheriff Tom Brewster, the former lawman who had investigated the fire, and after some digging, uncovered a few old debts Mason had quietly paid off for local officials. Tom didn't hesitate when Jack and Julia told him the truth. "I always knew something stank about that night," he muttered. Mason's name came up more than once, but no one wanted to listen. Now retired, Tom didn't have authority, but he had resources. One of them was a tech-savvy nephew who handed over a pocket-sized recorder with a nod. "Just get him talking," the kid said. "We'll handle the rest." Back in the meeting room, Colt Mason leaned back in his leather chair, one hand swirling the ice in his whiskey glass. He'd offered Julia a drink she politely declined, and now he was going on about legacy and investing in the heart of Millersfield. Julia smiled, listening carefully. "You've done so much for the town," she said gently. "The rebuilding, the housing grants, the business recovery fund. It's almost like you were planning for the town to fall apart just so you could save it." Colt chuckled. "That's how it works, sweetheart. You don't wait for the storm, you build the ark before the clouds even roll in." Julia tilted her head. "Did you always know the cabin would burn down?" The question was casual, almost airy. Colt looked at her. "What did you say? I just mean, was that part of your plan too? Clearing space, flipping the land after the fire, you acquired half the ridge. Pretty convenient, don't you think?" Colt's smile didn't quite reach his eyes now. "Careful, Ms. Blake. You're asking dangerous questions, just curious," she replied, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "My brother died in that fire, remember, so forgive me if I still want answers." There was a beat of silence. Then Colt leaned forward, eyes cold. "Your brother stuck his nose where it didn't belong. You should be smarter than that." And there it was, not a confession but close, and enough to rattle the man who thought no one would ever dare confront him. Outside, Jack watched as Julia emerged from the building, her steps quick but controlled. She didn't speak until they were in the car with the doors shut. He hinted, "Threatened me, didn't deny a thing." Jack took the recorder from her pocket and played the key segment. "Your brother stuck his nose where it didn't belong. You should be smarter than that." Tom Brewster listened later that night and nodded slowly. "It won't convict him, but it opens the door. If we can find someone who worked for him back then, someone who'll talk, we can build a case." And they had someone in mind. Her name was Dinah Reyes. She had been a receptionist at Colt's office back in 2010, the summer of the fire. She'd since moved to a small cabin outside of Millersfield, living off-grid, rarely seen in town. Jack and Julia made the trip up to her place the next morning, bringing coffee and muffins. Dinah was wary at first. Wary of people, wary of questions, and most of all, wary of the name Colt Mason. But when Julia mentioned Marcus's name, her expression softened. "I liked that boy," Dinah said. "He came by once. Wanted to see paperwork. I didn't know much then, just that Colt was scared, told me to say I'd never seen him." "Did he ever mention a fire?" Jack asked. Dinah looked down. "He told one of the contractors to clear it all after the summer, said he didn't care how, just wanted the insurance to pay out before the books got audited. I didn't think he meant an actual fire until it happened." "Would you be willing to tell that to the sheriff?" She hesitated, fear flickering in her eyes. "I have kids," she said. "And Mason, he's dangerous." Julia reached for her hand. "We'll protect you. You'd be helping a lot of people and giving Marcus the justice he never got." Dinah looked between them, then gave a slow, resolute nod. "I'll talk." With Dinah's statement and the audio clip, Tom Brewster was finally able to convince the district attorney to reopen the investigation into the fire. But news travels fast in Millersfield, and the next day, Jack's car windows were smashed. The message was clear. Back off, only Jack wasn't the kid who left town with his tail between his legs anymore. And Julia. She was done being afraid. That night, after putting Ava to bed, Julia and Jack stood in the living room of her home, boxes of evidence stacked between them. Photos, documents, audio files. The journal Marcus had written now copied, scanned, and backed up twice. "Are you scared?" Julia asked. Jack paused. "Yeah, but not of him." "Of what then?" He looked at her. "Of losing you again." She stepped closer. "You won't." They kissed soft, steady, with years of grief and forgiveness folded between them. It wasn't passion that drove the moment. It was survival, connection, the recognition of something broken that had been made whole again, piece by jagged piece. The next morning, as Jack drove Ava to school, something he'd started doing regularly, now Julia got a call from Claire Jules. "You need to come to the library." "Why? What happened?" "There's a man here asking for the journal." Julia froze. "What man?" "He won't give a name, but he says Marcus owed him, and if you don't hand it over, he'll come looking." Julia's stomach dropped. Mason sent him, she whispered. She grabbed her keys and ran out the door, but as she pulled out of the driveway, she didn't notice the black sedan idling 2 blocks away. Inside it, a man in a gray jacket lifted a camera, snapped a photo, then picked up his phone. She's moving. You ready? A voice on the other end responded coldly. Don't let her get too far. Hunted by the past. The silence inside the Millersfield library was deceptive. Shelves of worn books, the soft tick of a clock, and filtered light pouring through high windows gave the illusion of safety, but Julia felt anything but safe. Claire was pale when she walked Julia to the back reading room. He was sitting right here, she whispered, pointing to a leather chair by the archives door, tall, early 40s, maybe clean cut, but something about him. He didn't feel like someone who came in for a library card. Julia's hands tightened on her purse strap. What did he say? He asked about Marcus Blake, then about you. Then he said you had something that didn't belong to you. Claire reached into the drawer behind the checkout desk and pulled out a flash drive. I made a backup of Marcus's journal, just in case. Julia smiled, but her eyes didn't. She had a feeling that backup would soon be more valuable than gold. Meanwhile, Jack was driving back from dropping off Ava at school, the wind rushing through the half-cracked window of his truck. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. His rear-view mirror showed a black sedan 3 cars back. Nothing suspicious yet. It had followed him for the last few turns. He made a sudden right onto a gravel road circling a farm lot, then another sharp left into the alley behind the general store. The sedan followed. He slammed the brakes. The car behind him skidded, slightly caught off guard. Jack stepped out, calm but ready. His phone was already recording. Can I help you? He called, approaching the car. The window rolled down slowly. A man in sunglasses stared back at him, expression unreadable. You're Jack Cole. I am. And you are. Just a friend of someone you've been looking into. Word of advice. Some questions are better left unanswered. Like who started the fire that killed Marcus Blake? The man smirked. Sometimes truth gets people hurt. He handed Jack a card. No name, just a phone number and one word: negotiate. Then the sedan peeled away, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake. Julia's phone buzzed as Jack pulled into her driveway. Jack, we've got company. Whoever Mason's using isn't just watching. They're sending messages. Julia, me too. Claire got a visit. They want the journal, Jack. We need to move fast. They met an hour later at the sheriff's office. Tom Brewster was already on edge. The DA's office is stalling. Says we need stronger evidence before bringing Mason in, but I think they're scared. Mason's been greasing palms for years. Jack dropped the card onto the desk. We've got a name now, or at least a number. He's got muscle. Scaring Claire, following me. Tom studied the card. We need a public move, something visible. If Mason thinks he can keep this in the shadows, he'll win. Julia took a breath. Then let's drag it into the light. That night they did something bold. They held a memorial vigil for Marcus Blake 13 years after his death, open to the public. Julia posted it online. Claire called the local paper. Tom quietly tipped off a regional journalist. The flyer was simple. In memory of Marcus Blake, a life lost, a truth awaiting justice. It was a risk, and Mason took the bait. The vigil was held at the clearing where the cabin once stood. Lanterns hung from tree branches. Photos of Marcus lined a wooden table. Julia stood at the center, trembling slightly as neighbors and strangers gathered. Jack stood beside her, holding her hand. She spoke first. My brother died here, and for years we believed it was just a tragic accident. But now we know the truth. Marcus was trying to protect this town. He knew something worth silencing. There were murmurs in the crowd. Tom rose to step up forward. Next, we have reopened the investigation. If you know anything at all, it's time to come forward. Then from the back of the crowd, a voice rang out. You're playing a dangerous game. Ms. Blake. The crowd parted. Colt Mason stood there, flanked by 2 men in dark coats. This is slander, he said. You have no proof. Just old stories and paranoia. Julia stepped forward, her voice clear. We have your voice. We have your payments, and we have your former employee's sworn statement. Colt's jaw tensed. That's enough. He turned to leave, but the sheriff's cruiser blocked the road. Tom stepped up. Mr. Mason, I'm placing you under investigation, pending further questioning. The men beside Mason stepped forward, but the townspeople closed ranks. For once Millersfield stood together. Jack whispered, We're not done yet. But the fight wasn't over. The next morning, Claire's library window was shattered and buried, and Dinah's tires were slashed, and Ava's school called Julia. Someone had been asking questions about her daughter. That last part, that was too far. Julia's world narrowed into one crystal clear focus: protect Ava. She pulled her out of school and kept her close, never letting her out of sight. Jack installed new locks, cameras, motion detectors. But one night, as thunder rumbled overhead and rain poured against the windows, Ava walked into the living room, her teddy bear clutched tight. "There was a man in the yard," she said softly. "He was looking in my window." Julia froze. Jack grabbed a flashlight and sprinted into the yard, but it was too late. Whoever it was, they were gone. But they had left something behind. Nailed to the tree outside Ava's room, a burned piece of wood, black and charred, carved with a single word: "Stop." Julia clutched Ava close, rocking her gently. Her hands trembled, but her voice was steady. "No, baby. We're not stopping." The next day, Tom brought news. An anonymous tip had come in. A contractor from Mason's old crew had agreed to talk. He'd been in the truck the night of the fire and he saw what happened. Mason had paid them to pour gasoline on the floor of the cabin to prepare it for demolition, he said. Marcus showed up unexpectedly. He argued with Mason. Things got heated. And then the fire started. The man ran. He thought Marcus had escaped too, but he hadn't. The tipster was ready to testify, and with him finally they had enough. A warrant was issued, but Mason was gone. Disappeared overnight. His phone dead, his house emptied, the hardware stores shut down. Jack stared at the closed storefront of Mason Home Supply and felt something sink in his gut. This isn't over. Later that night, Julia received an email. No sender, no subject, just a video attachment. She hit play. It was grainy footage shot from outside her house. Through the window, Ava could be seen coloring at the kitchen table. The timestamp read, "Today, 2:46 p.m., and below the video a message. You wanted the truth, now live with it." Full circle. The morning sun cut through the storm clouds like a blade, casting sharp light across the wet pavement of Millersfield. Julia stood at her kitchen sink, eyes fixed on the window, her coffee untouched. The video from the night before replayed in her mind. Grainy footage of her daughter Ava, completely unaware that someone had been watching her, filming her, threatening her. Julia wasn't afraid for herself anymore, but for Ava. She would burn the world down before letting anything happen to her little girl. Jack entered quietly, setting down his phone. "I've been calling everyone. No sign of Mason." "It's like he vanished." "He hasn't," Julia said. "He's watching somewhere, waiting for us to drop our guard." Jack met her eyes. Then we won't." That afternoon, Julia and Jack met Sheriff Tom Brewster and Claire at the town hall. The atmosphere was tense. They all knew Mason was still dangerous, perhaps more than ever, but they also had something they hadn't had 13 years ago: proof, witnesses, and each other. Tom spread out photos, emails, documents. Everything was organized, cross-referenced. Dina's testimony, the audio recording from Julia's meeting with Colt, the journal, the anonymous tip from Mason's former employee. It was airtight. "We take it public," Tom said. "Tonight, press conference, media, everything. If we can't bring him in, we'll smoke him out." Jack agreed. "The more people watching, the harder it'll be for him to hide." "But we do it on our terms," Julia said. "Not in front of Ava. She's staying with Claire." That night, in the town square, beneath glowing streetlights and a large white tent, dozens of townspeople gathered. News vans from 3 nearby counties lined the street. Cameras, reporters, lights. Julia stood behind a wooden podium, Jack beside her, Tom and Claire behind them. She cleared her throat. "My name is Julia Blake. 13 years ago, my brother Marcus died in a fire that was ruled an accident, but it wasn't." She told the story calmly, truthfully, about the permits, the shell companies, the forged documents. And Colt, Mason, Jack followed, speaking of guilt and exile, of justice delayed but not denied. Then Sheriff Brewster stepped up and for the first time in public named Colt Mason as a person of interest in an active criminal investigation. The crowd murmured. Then a crack, a loud pop echoed through the square. Screams erupted. Jack threw himself in front of Julia as the crowd scattered. But it wasn't a gunshot. It was a backfire. A motorcycle peeled away from the alley behind the square, its rider masked, dressed in black. Tom radioed in immediately. "Follow that bike. North Alley. Move now." Officers gave chase, but within minutes the rider was gone, just like before, like smoke. Back at Julia's house, Claire was comforting Ava when she noticed a manila envelope shoved under the front door. Inside was a single photo of Ava. On the swings at school, a handwritten note below: "You're not the only one who knows how to leave a mark." Claire called Julia immediately. Her voice shook. Enough was enough. Jack and Julia checked into a secure hotel that night. Ava slept between them safe and warm, while Jack paced by the window, phone pressed to his ear. He had made a call to someone he never thought he'd speak to again. His older brother, Aaron Cole, lived 2 states over, a former federal investigator, the black sheep of the family until Jack needed him most. Aaron arrived the next morning, dressed in jeans, worn boots, and a leather satchel full of surveillance equipment. "I hear you've got a rat with money problems and a hero complex," he said, greeting Jack with a tight hug. Julia filled him in, everything. Aaron just nodded. "I've dealt with guys like Mason before. They always make the same mistake. They think they're too smart to get caught. What they forget is when people have nothing left to lose, they get brave." Aaron set up a sting. He posed as a private broker, someone looking to launder money through property deals. A bait email was sent to Mason's last known account. The reply came 2 hours later. "Meet me in person. Tonight alone. Bring cash." The location, the burned cabin site, the same clearing where Marcus had died, the same place where everything had begun. Julia insisted on going. "No," Jack said firmly. "You're not a cop. You're not trained for this. I'm the reason he's scared," she replied. "He won't talk to anyone else." Aaron stepped in. "He's right, Jules, but you can watch from a safe distance. Jack wears a wire. I'll have eyes on the perimeter, and Sheriff Brewster's got backup ready." She nodded reluctantly and then whispered, "End it." Dusk fell like a veil. Jack walked alone to the clearing, the moon high above the trees. In his jacket, a hidden mic, a burner phone, and a photo of Marcus Colt. Mason stepped out from the shadows. He looked older, harsher. His expensive clothes hung stiff over his frame like he'd worn armor so long he forgot how to take it off. "You just don't give up, do you?" Mason sneered. "I want the truth," Jack said. "The truth is what you make it. You made yourself a villain. I just let you run with it. You forged my name, set up the fire, and killed Marcus. Accidents happen," Mason said coldly. "He was in the way. And Ava." Jack snapped. "You sent men to watch a little girl." Mason hesitated. For a second, guilt flickered in his eyes. "I didn't want that. I only wanted silence. You pushed too far." Jack took out the photo. "He was my best friend." "I know." Jack stepped forward. "Say it just once. Say what you did." Mason's mouth twitched. "I killed him." The words hung in the air, and behind the trees every word was being recorded. Mason was arrested that night, charged with arson, fraud, and involuntary manslaughter. The headlines exploded. The town of Millersfield finally saw its truth unveiled. Marcus Blake's name was cleared, and Jack Cole, he was no longer a suspect. Months passed. Winter came and went. Julia reopened her brother's old foundation in his name, the Blake Initiative, supporting whistleblowers and victims of small-town corruption. Claire was elected to the city council. Sheriff Brewster officially retired, but this time with a legacy of justice. Aaron returned to his cabin in Oregon, leaving Jack with a quiet handshake and a proud smile, and Ava. She smiled more, slept better, trusted deeper. One crisp spring afternoon, Jack pulled Julia aside in the garden behind their new home, a place they bought together on the edge of Millersfield. He knelt down on one knee, pulled out a simple ring. "I loved you." Then he said, "When we were kids and didn't know how the world worked, I loved you through all the silence, and I love you now stronger, wiser, more grateful than I ever thought possible." Julia's hand flew to her mouth. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, 1,000 times, yes." Ava ran into the yard moments later, giggling when she saw the ring. "Does this mean Jack's staying forever?" Julia laughed through tears. "Yes, baby, he's staying forever." That night, as stars shimmered over their backyard, Julia sat beside Jack on the porch holding his hand. She looked out at the woods, at the shadows that once haunted her, and whispered, "We didn't just survive this." Jack squeezed her fingers. "We made it through together." The past hadn't been erased, but it had been faced, and now finally, it was behind them.